So if a country gets richer, its society automatically gets more open and free. That's the baseline assumption of modern economics, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. It's the story we've been told for decades, really. It's the foundational logic behind globalization.
Exactly. I mean, the theory goes that you build up the economy, you integrate into global markets, people get disposable income, and then almost like a law of physics, the institutions just naturally follow suit.
Yeah, the idea is that society inevitably becomes more democratic, more transparent, and, constrained by the rule of law.
It is a comforting thought for sure. The idea that human progress operates on this inevitable single track escalator just moving ever upward. But what if that escalator is a complete illusion?
Well, that's what we're looking at today. Because what if the hard, inescapable macroeconomic data spanning more than 30 years proves that wealth does not necessarily liberate a society?
Right. What if, in a growing number of nations, all that new wealth is actually being weaponized to lock the existing closed system in place?
And that is the exact paradox we are unpacking today for you on this deep dive.
Hmm.
We are looking at an incredibly disruptive data set that fundamentally shatters traditional political science.
Yeah, and I have to say, looking at the source material sitting in front of me right now, the slide deck is intensely academic, but visually striking.
Oh, it really is.
It's all these stark white backgrounds, completely minimalist, no distracting 3D graphics, just sleek, sans serif fonts looks like Helvetica or something similar.
And the charts are layered in this really high-end gray, but then they hit you with these striking Klein blue and dark red highlights for the data points.
Yeah, it looks dead serious. And the data inside is honestly explosive.
It tracks the macroeconomic and political evolution of over 20 countries, starting from 1992, projecting all the way out to 2025, and even modeling scenarios for 2030.
And we are talking about a really diverse pool of nations here.
Absolutely. The dataset maps countries as economically and geographically diverse as Bangladesh, Barbados, Belarus, Belgium, Cabo Verde, just a really sweeping global sample.
So for you listening, our core mission for this deep dive is to guide you through the mechanics of this phenomenon. We need to understand the development paradox.
Right, we're going to unpack why economic prosperity, rather than acting as a catalyst for institutional openness, is increasingly serving to lock in these closed structures.
And just to set the table, we are not looking at a few cherry-picked anomalies here. This is a massive, multidimensional data set covering economics, societal health, justice systems, and political structures.
Yeah, slide 2 really lays out the variables we're tracking. You've got the Human Development Index, the GDP growth rate, the Multi-Party Democracy Index, and the Gini coefficient.
And what this data does right out of the gate, and this is right on slide 3, is it completely dismantles the foundational myth of the late 20th century.
The linear illusion.
Exactly. So on slide 3, there's this classic gray scatter plot. It maps raw economic output GDP against social development and democratization.
And there's this thick, confident, solid arrow pointing up and to the right.
Yeah, representing that linear illusion. The assumption that rising GDP, which is labeled here as WDI underscore GDP, inevitably brings high democracy and rule of law.
The WJP civic justice variable, exactly.
Right. It's like leveling up in a video game. We just collectively assumed that once a country hoards enough GDP coins, they automatically unlock the open society skill tree.
I like that analogy.
But looking at this data, it's like someone modded the game, right? The expected mechanics are totally broken.
They really are. The data completely severs that link. And slide 4 introduces what we might call a parallel universe of development.
Yeah, this slide is wild. It isolates Belarus and Bangladesh.
Right, so if you look at the dual axis chart for these countries over a 20-year tracking period, the economic engine is just roaring.
The bar charts representing per capita GNI, that's gross national income, are just soaring. They literally double.
The wealth is undeniably real. Factories are operating, infrastructure is modernizing, exports are flowing out. But, and here is the massive reversal, when you overlay that soaring economic growth with the polyarchy index.
That's the VDEM polyarchy variable, right?
Yes, which measures institutional openness, clean elections, freedom of expression. That line completely flatlines.
It's just hovering permanently in this low 0.3 to 0.4 range. In some years, it actually drops.
It's incredible. And the visual here, the data set, uses this red dash circle on slide 1, and then a dark double-headed arrow on slide 4 to show this widening gap.
The scissors gap.
Exactly. The blade of economic growth is pointing sharply upward, and the blade of democratic institutions is pointing straight ahead or slightly down.
So the initial influx of wealth was a stimulus, but it totally failed to trigger that expected systemic evolution.
Because economic modernization is happening entirely parallel to and completely decoupled from political modernization. The wealth isn't liberating the system.
Which brings us to a really pressing question. I mean, if a country is getting twice as rich, but the system isn't opening up, where exactly is all that money going?
And why aren't the citizens demanding change?
Right. If I'm looking at slide 5, which tracks the Gini coefficient, meaning wealth inequality, there are these prominent red circles marking the peaks.
The inequality is peaking right alongside the GDP in these high-growth nations.
The income share held by the top 10% of earners is just massive. So the wealth is heavily concentrated at the very top.
And that wealth concentration is not a failure of their system. It is essentially the load-bearing pillar of it.
How so?
Well, think about a classical liberal economic model. Broad-based economic growth creates a financially independent middle class. And historically, a financially independent middle class starts demanding political rights.
Right, because they pay taxes, they own property, and they want some sort of structural check on executive power to protect what they've built.
Exactly. But in these parallel systems, the data shows the fruits of this immense economic expansion are deliberately funneled upward.
So they never form that demanding middle class.
Right. Instead, this concentrated wealth provides the central power structure with an almost inexhaustible reservoir of resources. They use it to aggressively reward loyalists and fund a massive state apparatus.
So the wealth doesn't create a challenger to the state. It literally supercharges the state itself.
Precisely.
But wait, let me push back on that a bit. Wealth concentration at the top makes sense for the elites, but what about the rest of the population, especially the youth?
A demographic threat.
Yeah, I'm looking at slide 8. It shows the population age pyramids and this median age curve. These countries are experiencing massive youth bulges.
Huge percentages of the population are young, increasingly educated, and trying to enter the workforce.
And if you look at the overlap here between youth unemployment and labor participation, historically speaking, a massive youth bulge of educated people without jobs is the ultimate catalyst for a revolution.
It's a total powder keg.
So how are these highly unequal closed systems surviving that demographic pressure cooker?
They survive it through a highly calculated deployment of that concentrated wealth we just talked about. The data reveals what we can call the sponge strategy.
A sponge strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of leaving these educated, potentially frustrated youths to fester in the streets and organize politically, the state uses its immense economic resources to aggressively expand public sector employment.
Oh, wow. I see that on the chart. The variable is WWBI, public sector employment total. They just hire them all.
They absorb them. The state acts as a massive sponge. They create millions of bureaucratic roles, administrative jobs, positions within state-owned enterprises.
So they bring the potential revolutionaries inside the tent.
Exactly. You don't rebel against the system that signs your paycheck.
That is brilliantly cynical and terrifyingly logical. But I mean, I have to challenge the sustainability of that.
Sure.
You can't just invent millions of bureaucratic jobs out of thin air forever without triggering massive inflation or completely bankrupting the state, right?
Yeah. Well, they manage it through the immense capital generated by that earlier scissors gap. Because the state captured the lion's share of the explosive GDP growth, they have the war chest to fund this bloat.
Wow. So they literally bought their way out of a demographic crisis.
And the psychological impact is profound. It neutralizes the threat completely. It transforms a volatile youth bulge into a dependent, salaried class of state employees.
Right, because your livelihood, your ability to secure a mortgage, support a family, it all becomes entirely tethered to the survival of the existing political structure.
It's the ultimate golden handcuff. If the regime falls, your pension vanishes, your job vanishes, so you actively root for the stability of the closed system.
That perfectly explains how they pacify the youth. But what about the actual day-to-day quality of life?
What do you mean?
Well, for a long time, the academic consensus was that a closed system would inevitably become too corrupt and inefficient to provide for its citizens' basic needs.
Ah, yes. The assumption that you literally could not achieve optimal public health and education outcomes without civic freedoms.
Right. But slide 6 proves that assumption entirely false. And the visualization here is fantastic. It's this radar chart using contrasting color blocks.
It's perhaps one of the most profound paradigm shifts in the whole data set.
Yeah, it shows the Human Development Index, the UNDP, HDI, and life expectancy expanding outward, taking up more and more area on the radar chart.
While the political freedom scores are contracting inward.
The divergence is staggering. So even without political competition, literacy rates are skyrocketing. Life expectancy is making massive leaps.
Which proves that livelihood improvements have completely unbundled from political reform. The state has proven it's highly capable of delivering better health care and building schools without conceding an inch of political power.
So you can live to be 80, be perfectly literate, have access to cutting-edge medicine, and still have absolutely no say in who runs the country.
Yes, and the state relies on this.
Yeah.
Delivering on human development is a form of performance legitimacy.
Meaning, if my life is tangibly better today than 10 years ago, I'm not going to complain.
Exactly. If your daily life and your family's health are improving, you're far less likely to demand abstract political rights. Tangible progress buys immense political complacency.
You know, there is a specific nuance to this modernization on slide 7 that I find fascinating. It has to do with gender equality.
The minimalist area chart.
Right. It tracks labor metrics, and there is a steady, undeniable rise in female labor force participation and a steady increase in the percentage of women holding government roles.
Now, usually we associate progressive gender equality metrics exclusively with liberal, open democracies.
Yeah, so it feels like an anomaly here. My analogy for this is, well, it feels exactly like updating the user interface of a smartphone app.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. The state pushes an update, and suddenly the UI looks incredibly modern, sleek, and progressive. It looks just like the apps running in the West. But the core operating system hasn't changed one bit.
It's a completely safe update.
Exactly.
That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. This safe modernization serves two incredibly beneficial purposes for a closed system.
What's the first one?
First, on a purely macroeconomic level, it dramatically boosts the labor supply. If you suddenly integrate millions of women into the formal workforce, your GDP is going to jump. It's economically vital to escape stagnation.
And the second purpose?
International perception. It allows these states to present a highly modernized space to the global community. They can point to their rising gender equality metrics and claim alignment with global development goals.
As a sort of whitelist metric?
Precisely. But the critical reality the data exposes is that elevating women in the workforce does not directly threaten the underlying political logic.
Right. The upward arrow marking female metrics on the chart literally has text next to it saying improvement without touching core power.
It doesn't alter the core power structures or place any real constraints on the supreme executive. It's an approved, safe modernization.
Okay, so summarizing the playbook so far. They capture the wealth from economic growth. They use that wealth to provide government jobs to pacify the youth. They raise life expectancy to keep people satisfied, and they promote gender equality to boost the economy and look good globally.
It is an incredibly robust, deeply thought-out system.
But, I mean, governing a modern economy isn't just handing out jobs and building hospitals. You have to enforce business contracts. You have to fight crime.
The messy, practical realities.
Yeah. How does a closed system manage all of that efficiently while still maintaining absolute control at the top?
They achieve this through what the data defines as the dual-track governance model. And this requires us to discard another major assumption on slide 9.
This part of the data really messes with my head. Usually we assume that systemic corruption inherently ruins government efficiency.
You would expect a clean, linear relationship. High control of corruption equals high effectiveness.
Right. But the scatter plot here maps government effectiveness against the control of corruption, and it isolates this bizarre cluster of countries with a dashed line.
The cluster of high effectiveness paired with remarkably low control of corruption.
They are highly efficient, but they are highly corrupt. How is that functionally possible? Don't those two things cancel each other out?
Not in a dual-track system. What the state has figured out is how to ruthlessly compartmentalize. Meaning in specific sectors, say, building a high-speed rail network or national digital infrastructure, the state exhibits extreme capacity and efficiency.
Because they don't have to navigate partisan gridlock or local opposition.
Exactly. So the state capacity is there.
Where does the corruption fit in, then?
In this model, corruption is not a bug. It is a vital feature. It's a tolerated, often actively utilized lubricant.
A lubricant to keep the elites aligned.
Yes. Systemic corruption kickbacks, patronage networks, is meticulously managed to keep the political and economic elites perfectly aligned with the central power structure.
So they essentially turn a blind eye to elite enrichment, as long as the infrastructure gets built and the elites remain totally loyal.
Exactly. It's hyper-efficient for the state's goals and highly profitable for the loyalists.
But what about the law itself? If the elites are essentially above the law, how do everyday businesses function?
Slide 10 looks at the rule of law metrics, and there's a massive divergence in the bar charts.
Right, between civil justice and constraints on government power.
Yeah, they have incredibly high scores for everyday civil justice, but abysmal scores for constraints on government power.
That divergence is the hallmark of the dual-track legal system. It demonstrates the profound elasticity of the rule of law.
So it's like a massive highway system.
Okay, let's hear it.
For everyday civil disputes, property rights, enforcing standard business contracts, the stuff businesses need to function, the traffic laws are strictly enforced. The lanes are painted clearly, speed limits are checked by radar.
Because the state knows you need that predictability for the economy to grow. Right, but the supreme executive power, they get to drive on the shoulder. They get to speed without a limit. They can ignore the red lights entirely.
That is exactly how it functions. The law applies rigidly to the free market, but it has total elasticity when it comes to the regime.
But surely the citizens see this hypocrisy. Why do they put up with it? Why accept a system where the leadership operates completely outside the legal constraints placed on everyone else?
The answer lies in the ultimate social contract, which is driven by the data on violence and internal security on slide 11.
This time series graph is a really stark visual. It tracks two lines moving in completely opposite directions over time.
One of the most revealing charts in the deck.
On one hand, you have plummeting murder rates. The trajectory just goes down, down, down. And on the other hand, you have skyrocketing spending on internal security and armed forces.
This represents the dividend of social security. If we step back and look at human psychology, what is the most fundamental, base-level human need?
Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Safety is right at the bottom.
Exactly. It's physical safety. These states pour immense resources into internal security, mass surveillance, and highly visible policing.
And the tangible result is a rock-solid baseline of physical order.
They drastically lower violent crime. They essentially eliminate street-level chaos. And this forms an unbreakable psychological defense line for the regime.
So the citizens willingly trade their abstract political freedoms for tangible physical safety.
It is a deliberate macro transaction. If you're an average citizen and you know you can walk down the street at 2 in the morning without any fear, you are far more likely to accept the elasticity of executive power.
We will keep you safe. In exchange, you will not question how we govern.
Exactly. And for millions of people who prioritize stability over agency, that is an entirely acceptable trade.
Which is a deeply sobering thought, but the data completely backs it up. You just can't argue with the plummeting crime rates.
No, you can't.
But this brings up a massive external contradiction for me. These countries aren't acting in a vacuum. They aren't isolated hermit kingdoms shutting out the world.
Not at all. They are heavily integrated into the global economy.
Right. So how do they interact with the world, taking foreign capital without letting outside liberal democratic ideas infect their carefully closed systems?
They manage it by constructing a highly sophisticated filter. Slide 12 tracks this with a striking Sankey diagram.
Yeah, this diagram maps the flow of resources entering the country. On the left, the economic side, you have these massive, wide bands flowing in. Huge amounts of foreign direct investment and international trade imports.
But then look at the right side of the diagram.
Yeah, the channel representing information transparency and external political influence narrows down to a tiny, microscopic trickle.
It completely dismantles the Trojan horse theory of capitalism.
Right. Because for decades, the West firmly believed that if you opened trade with a closed society, the influx of capital would inevitably carry democratic ideals with it.
We thought the internet would be the ultimate democratizing force.
But the state apparatus in these parallel universe countries has perfected the global firewall.
Deep economic globalization did not bring automatic ideological globalization. Their strategy is incredibly precise. Take the capital, filter the thoughts.
They will eagerly accept your factories and supply chains, but physically and digitally block your political philosophy.
They do not treat the internet as a borderless public square. They treat it as sovereign, tightly regulated territory.
And the data shows it works. They successfully separate the money from the message. But I mean, I keep looking for the weak point in this architecture.
You think it's fragile?
Yeah. A highly centralized, heavily filtered system that relies on constant economic growth seems like it would be incredibly brittle. It feels like it would shatter the moment there's a real, uncontrollable crisis.
That is yet another Western assumption that slide 13 comprehensively shatters.
The step charts and recovery curves.
Yes. Look at the recovery curves from massive global shocks, specifically the 2008 global financial crisis and the 2020 global pandemic.
The resilience is shocking. You see the economy take a hit, just like the rest of the world, but the bounce back is incredibly rapid. The GDP curves are deeply V-shaped.
And throughout these periods of global chaos, look at the solid green line representing inflation.
It remains strictly, rigidly controlled.
We often assume that closed systems lack the flexibility to adapt to external shocks, that their rigid bureaucracies will just freeze.
But the data shows the exact opposite.
Because power is completely centralized and unconstrained by legislative pushback, they can pivot the entire macroeconomic structure of the country overnight.
They don't have to wait for partisan gridlock in a parliament. They don't have to negotiate stimulus packages for months.
Exactly. They can deploy capital instantly. They can build emergency infrastructure in days. They can institute sweeping price controls without legal challenges.
So surviving the crisis doesn't expose their authoritarianism. It actually makes them stronger.
Surviving and rapidly recovering from these global disasters actively cements their legitimacy.
Oh, I see.
The state can turn to the population and say, look at the open democracies. Look at their political gridlock, their rampant inflation, their chaotic pandemic responses. Now look at us. We protected you. We recovered faster.
Extreme competence in a crisis becomes the ultimate justification for total control. We kept you safe.
It all ties right back to that fundamental social contract of physical and economic security.
Okay, this has been an absolute paradigm shift. Let's pull all of this together and look at what this means for the future, because slide 14 basically forces us to redefine our entire coordinate system.
It demands that we accept the reality of nonlinear, multipolar modernization.
Yeah, the concept map here is so simple but so profound. For decades, academia believed that economic growth, human development, and institutional evolution were braided together into a single rope.
We assumed if you pulled one string, the other two automatically came with it.
But this deep dive proves they are not a braided rope. The visual here shows them as three entirely separate parallel arrows pointing forward.
The tracking from 1992 to 2025 proves they are completely unbundled. A nation can have a skyrocketing GDP. It can have citizens living long, healthy, literate lives.
And it can simultaneously have absolutely zero checks and balances on executive power.
Those three realities can coexist in a highly stable, deeply entrenched modern state structure.
We have to stop sitting around waiting for wealth to automatically generate freedom. But this brings us to the final and frankly most unsettling projection in the entire data set on slide 15.
The ultimate test of this development paradox.
It's this incredibly minimalist slide, just a single dashed line pointing toward the future, hitting the year 2030, and then splitting into two violently diverging paths.
The fork in the road.
Yeah. The top path is labeled crossing the middle income trap, and the bottom path is labeled explosion of structural contradictions.
Which raises an incredibly profound question about the limits of this model. It hinges on the biological ticking clock inherent in their strategy.
Right, because think about everything we have discussed today. The absolute core requirement for the stability of this paradox is a roaring economic engine.
The regime relies on the demographic dividend. They need explosive wealth to operate that massive public sector sponge and endlessly hire young people into the bureaucracy.
But demographics are destiny. The youth bulge eventually ages.
Exactly. What happens when the population growth inevitably stalls?
Yeah, what happens when the workforce ages, the burden of pensions explodes, and the economic engine slows down from double-digit growth to mere single-digit stagnation?
That is the chilling question I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over.
The golden handcuffs that keep the population loyal only work if the state has an endless supply of gold to pay for them.
Once that massive economic growth slows down, once the state can no longer guarantee that tomorrow will be tangibly richer than today, that specific economic legitimacy is stripped away.
When they can't afford to absorb the youth into the bureaucracy, which fork in that 2030 road will these countries take?
Will the loss of economic momentum force them to finally open up their institutions to spur innovation?
Or will those suppressed structural contradictions finally explode into chaos?
It is the great unknown of the 21st century. The data leaves that path completely blank because the math stops there.
The linear illusion is dead, but this new paradoxical stability has an expiration date tied directly to its GDP.
The history of that upcoming divergence is not preordained. It is being written right now by the macroeconomic decisions being made today.
It really makes you reconsider every piece of global news you read. I want to thank you for joining us on this data-heavy, perspective-shifting deep dive.
It's been a fascinating look at the data.
It really is not often you look at the raw macroeconomic numbers and realize your entire worldview needs to be fundamentally recalibrated.
Keep questioning those linear assumptions.
We started by asking if getting richer automatically makes a country more free. The undeniable answer from the data is no. The X-ray machine of traditional economics is broken. We are navigating the murky, highly complex waters of a parallel universe now, and the old maps no longer apply. We will see you on the next deep dive.